Anarcho-Primitivism tells us a lot about what's wrong, the bad things about what's happened in the history of humankind. What do you think the relative merits, the relative value of some anarcho-primitivist program would be? Like, how could they, like, if the call is for saying no to technology and no to civilization, how can this be implemented? Or can you tell us more about how that can be implemented?
Sure, yeah, and that's the thing
maintained across the globe?
Okay, sure, and that's kind of the thing I didn't really have time to get to when I was preparing this. But I mean, basically, yeah, implementation is obviously the largest problem with the anarcho-primitivist project. Basically, anarcho-primitivists don't say that we need to abstain from the use of technology in our everyday lives. They look at the system of technology and see that as it is imposed in societies, that it has these destructive effects. That does not mean that we cannot use the tools of technology against, oppressive systems such as civilization, right? Like Native Americans used guns to fight against the cavalry, things like that. As far as
not just the fight against the cavalry.
What's that?
Not just the fight against the cavalry.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, they used guns.
Sure, they used guns.
Once they gained access to that technology, they used that technology because it was advantageous.
Sure, but they did,
only by something like taboos, which we don't really have access to in our world in the same way that tribal societies. I mean, taboos. That's how it works. There's a taboo on maybe shooting this, that, or the other. We do, but not in the same way.
Okay, but in order for Indians, Indians use guns, which they purchase from the whites. In order for Indians to adopt guns as a system of technology, right, they would need to adopt the industrial structure which mass-produced guns. They didn't do this. And if they were to do this would have transformed their society radically, and they would have probably more resembled the white society. As far as how this could be maintained across the globe, that's a pretty darn good question. What I would say is that civilizations rise and fall throughout the history of civilizations. When they fall, the trend is that the people go back to decentralized ways of life, right? When the Roman Empire fell, that's how slavery in the Roman Empire was ended. They returned to, to decentralized small-scale farming and things like that, which eventually degenerated into feudalism and then gave rise to another civilization. But I don't necessarily know that we can ever be completely free of civilization. What I do think is that we can resist civilization, and that civilizations can collapse, and we can at least buy some time before the next one arises. Great.
I noticed a couple things that seemed incongruent. And if you don't mind, I'll touch on a few of them in your talk. Okay. You talked about the Luddites, right? And then you talked about that the growth of civilization in England during the Industrial Revolution and here at the ending entailed profit, growth, and property, right? And it seems, and then of course, right, you talked about the TV bombarding this culture, and then it seems that going all the way back, the central question of which technology is sort of a prop for is the question of the individual against the organization. And that the organization generates these things like profit, growth, and property, and can also do so in incredible qualities, but in doing so, right, has to suppress the individual, right? And this creates a sort of tension. But it seems that there's a fundamental flaw with this notion of the distinction or incommensurability of the individual of the organization. And this goes to one of the most important modern, just one of the most important notions in the history of humanity. And I would encourage you to read Niccolo Machiavelli's Discourses on Titus Livy, because Machiavelli was one of the greatest democratic thinkers. But it's the notion of republicanism, right? And the notion of republicanism entails that one's organization simultaneously is caught up and expresses the will of the individual in its functioning. And so in this case, right, it seems that the organization itself is not necessarily contrary to the individual will. And if you have a properly republican state or organization or centralization, right, then it's not at all difficult to have a popular will expressed. For example, the television, TV bombarding, and it creates the white oppressor's message, right, and generates it. What I think pretty constantly through most of these critiques of technology is what is happened is cause is mistaken for effect. It seems quite clear that the native people adopt, where they're not coercively forced to, right, when natives or indigenous groups adopt the cultural mores of Western powers, that doesn't show the efficacy and strength of Western powers. That shows the degeneration of will and community already present. Because you could very easily have a poor, virtuous republic. And in fact, the success of Rome was literally based on, during its strongest republican phase, on being a poor, virtuous republic. And in fact, right, Maximilian Quintinius, Cincinnatus, right, of which we have a city named Cincinnati, was so poor that he had to plow his fields himself by hand. And but yet he himself, because of his virtue and skill, was twice elected dictator of Rome, and was constantly aggravated while defending Rome in this purely republican fashion, that by the time he returned home, his finances would be ruined because he took nothing from the republic. And so, I mean, the cut of my critique should be obvious here, but I'll pose it as a very simple question. How would you respond to those who say that centralization and organization can properly express individual will if they have proper egalitarian and republican virtues?
I don't know how I would respond to that question.
Okay. That's a fair answer.
How would anarcho-primitivists respond to that question? Do they have a good response?
I also don't know the answer to that question.
Well, wouldn't it just be an anarchist response? Any man over a man is still the problem. The problem is men over men. And so if you try to elect a guy, even how virtuous, how great, how wonderful a person he is, if you elect him to be a leader, he's still over you. And it's still inflicting into your individual freedom. And so that's the reason why, is that anarcho-primitivism, at least anarchism, is that it's for individual freedom.
Thank you. But I think what happens is then there's an obscuring that's occurring here, which is that a political institution is not a man. And yes, political institutions, or a human being, more properly, right? A political institution is not a human being, and someone vested with power from a political institution does not entail the same rights of naked domination of an individual over an individual. And I think the Roman dictator is a great example of this, which is to say, when Rome is threatened deeply enough, and again, Rome is not perfect, but I think Rome is so much a valuable model that the French Revolution itself modeled after the Roman Republic.